Hello folks, Dr. Chris Algieri, founder of Thought Puzzle. I'm a dad, a veteran, an entrepreneur. So folks, you see this gentleman here on the screen. He's really good. He's got 4 tennis rackets going. I'm not going to do that for you. But what we're going to do is talk about juggling and why juggling is useful to start thinking about what imagination means. For instance, when you first start juggling, you start with 1. And you sit there and do this, or stand, for a good long while until you get used to getting altitude right, tempo right, all those other things. You get to do it with your other hand. Now it turns out I'm left-handed, so this is my weak hand. You can see it's not quite as consistent, but that's okay. It's good enough that I can actually juggle. Now most folks think they get right into 3. You don't actually do that. You actually do get into 2. The trick though is that with 2 you're only doing it in 1 hand, because otherwise you end up doing something kind of weird like this, which actually becomes very hard to time. So what you end up doing is 2. And you learn to switch hands, maybe. You learn to switch hands. Switch hands again. Pick up the dropped ball, and you keep going. Just like gymnastics or dance or any other performing art. So you learn to do this, and you say, well, that's kind of interesting. What if I bump that up a little bit? What if I learn to do this? So then we can do other cool tricks and keep on juggling. But the point that I want you to take away from this is simply the following. When you learn to juggle, all you can do is picture in your mind or watch a video of some guy doing 3. Looks pretty interesting. And your question then becomes, how do you get from this to this? Or this? Or this? Turns out there's a really good book by a gentleman named Steve Johnson, and he talks in there about these things called plausible futures, adjacent possibles. So what's a plausible future? Well, a plausible future might be juggling 3 balls. It might be learning to parachute. It might be taking your company into some international market. It might be having a baby. It might be, in the case of a good friend of mine, simply getting on an airplane. Doesn't like to fly. Plausible future is that thing out there that you don't have, that you can't do right now. It's something beyond your current existence. An adjacent possible is simply this idea that you're here and you can go to this next step, followed by some other next step, and eventually, if you string together enough adjacent possibles, you get to that plausible future, or at least you make a valiant attempt trying, and hopefully you don't end up like Don Quixote. So, juggling was it for me many years ago. I was a kid, had a few spare months in my hand, my mom bought me a set of juggling sacks, and that was one of my plausible futures. So it turns out that when you are cultivating your imagination, when you are saying, what is my plausible future that I'm trying to reach? There are a lot of things to think about. One of the great business books out there is a book called Good to Great by Jim Collins, and his book is structured as a series of discrete elements with respect to building a great company. There's a lot of case studies in there, but in there he talks about things like momentum. He calls it the flywheel, being the hedgehog. So the flywheel is about building up this momentum and moving in a consistent direction, whereas the hedgehog is, what is that thing that you're going to move in the direction about? Is it going to be hiring people? Is it going to be building tech products? What is that? So he had principles. We're going to talk about principles of imagination. One big principle for imagination is simply scale. This idea that you can be big or you can be small, and you need to be able to understand and maintain perspective as you imagine this plausible future. I happen to have a PhD. In my case, that plausible future was a 20-year dream. It didn't set out to be a 20-year dream, but as a kid from Philly who had a 3-year scholarship to Virginia Tech that didn't start until the 2nd year, and his parents couldn't afford to co-sign a loan, I had to find a different option to even get to that bachelor's. So off I went to join the service. And I do a bunch of other things, we'll get to that later in the talk. The point is that when you get a PhD, it looks something like this. You see here on the slide, when you start learning, you have nothing. And then eventually you add a few things in, you get your bachelor's, that shell comes in, then you get a master's, and you start moving to what's the edge of known research. And eventually when you move to that PhD, you move right up against the actual edge, until eventually over a period of years you push the edge out a little further. But as these slides illustrate, you push that edge and you focus on that so much, and you're so down in the weeds at some point that you lose perspective, or you're at least at risk of losing that perspective. It's important, and I went through this, it took a couple of years to sort of regain perspective on what was important, because when I left, what was important was A, X, B, sigma, delta, gamma, all those cool things that had to do with Google's PageRank algorithm. When I left PhD school, though, I had to go back to that real world, and I had to regain that perspective. And it's important that when you're dealing with scale, that you understand perspective. If you say, well, my dream is this big, or my dream's this big, we need to understand how big that dream is, and how big are those adjacent possibles that you need to get there. So perspective, what does it mean? Well, let's take something very practical and tangible, beanbags. I can juggle with beanbags. I can hacky sack with beanbags, sometimes. What about a different size beanbag? What if we take this beanbag, twice the size, put a couple of those together, nice little mouse rest. Sometimes you can get a bigger one, you can get them for a wrist rest. Bigger perspective, let's zoom out a little more. Everybody loves beanbags. So here I am, I've got my beanbag, and I can sit down, and I'm watching TV, and I can juggle while I'm watching TV. Relaxing, right? But wait, what if I had a bigger beanbag? Well, we can do that. Turns out that we can get this guy, Big Joe. Now, Big Joe, I can make a chair out of Big Joe. My daughter, well, she's kind of small compared to me. She can actually sleep on Big Joe. And yes, there are bigger beanbags, none of which I can afford. So perspective, ladies and gentlemen. Tangible example of when you have something, what can you do with it if it was bigger? Or if you have something big, what can you do with it if it was smaller? Very often, those are the types of innovations and the ability to imagine that are the types of things that need new technology. The classic example, of course, is disk drives. Disk drives get smaller and smaller, and Apple made lots of money by realizing you take little disk drives and putting them inside of things, making music players that we all know and love. Scale and perspective. Let's take another example of scale and perspective. It turns out that there's two very famous photos called the blue dot and the blue marble. Now the blue dot is taken by Voyager 1. That spacecraft's been aloft almost as long as I've been alive. And it turns out that Earth is this very tiny pixel here, ladies and gentlemen. This is very tiny pixel. The blue marble, much higher resolution. And you see here that you can zoom in, you can see all that beauty of Earth. So at one end of the scale, you have Earth, not even a full pixel in that shot from Voyager 1, which by the way is at the edge of our solar system. Voyager 2 is at the other edge of our solar system. And then you have the blue marble, where you can zoom in and you can actually literally get a poster, not a small poster, mind you, a wall-sized poster made. And look at those. And that startling contrast between Earth as a pixel and Earth as this glass marble that we all know and live on suddenly begins to spawn things in that imagination. And so when you're dealing with issues of scale, one of the tricks in terms of in your imagination is to intentionally put things of multiple scale in front of you, at your disposal, at your ready access point. So that when you're sitting there, you say, oh, you know what, we did it for this over here and this over here, and what if we repurpose it in this way? Where does imagination begin? We're not going to get into brain theory, that's not my area of expertise. But one thing I am an expert on is books. What are the 10 books you take on a desert island? Classic question, right? These are just 10 books I happen to have laying around that cultivated my imagination when I was a kid. My favorites? Danny Dunn. Danny Dunn was a series in which a guy, two guys and a girl went around and solved science problems. One of the guys and one of the girls were really good at science, and one of the other guys was a poet. They got along famously, got into lots of scrapes. The interesting thing is that this was written in the early 70s. One of the co-authors actually was part of the Little Fugitive movie, which happens to be a world famous flick. That series was very influential on my ability to be comfortable with technology of any kind. C.S. Lewis, Chronicles of Narnia. Hiroshima, Now, the nuclear war was a big deal. I went through the Cold War, the latter stages of it. This is actually recollections of people that lived through the actual attack on Hiroshima and what their experiences were, getting hurt, their recoveries, those that were treating them. Shiloh, I actually didn't read this when I was young. I had to have kids and they brought it home. One of my favorites, Hugh McCloy, Evil Plans on the Road to World Domination. Important thing in that book is he encourages you to think about what your world is that you want to dominate. It's not the entire globe, it's your sphere of influence. What is that sphere of influence that you want to dominate? Log of the Mayflower. Historically accurate, but the way it's written causes you to think about what life was actually like coming across on the Mayflower. History of modern computing, followed up by one of the bigs in modern computing, father and son, Thomas Watson Jr., IBM. There's a section in here on being an executive officer on active duty, which I went into that job kicking and screaming. That book helped change my perspective. So why are books important? They force you to push the world around out of, you're no longer in that world, you're in the books world. This one, that's like my dissertation in a nutshell, or at least things that contributed to it. Great book, one of the most succinct explanations of how Google ruled the world mathematically. And a classic Dr. Seuss book. Everybody's got a classic Dr. Seuss book. This one, this particular actual book, was given to me by my parents. Movies. What are some of your favorite movies? Same deal. People go into the movies for escapism, but an important component of the movies is imagination. To move from I'm escaping the world to what if the world was different, and what in this movie can help me make my world different or make someone else's world different in a positive way. For me, some of the great ones, especially in recent years, Adjustment Bureau, Inception, and Limitless. All of them dealt with this idea of what if the world was a very different place. Some of them more constructive than others about it, but they really help you probe sort of the edge of what's really possible with respect to the human mind. Mementos. We're going to talk about these cults here in a moment. I'm going to talk about a smaller memento first. So it turns out I was on active duty I had 2 different stints, enlisted and commissioned. And one of the famous things is this idea of a coin. Now coins are simple mementos. And there's this history of the fact that coins were given to, you were really from an official unit. This was before they had DNA check and all these sorts of things. And so this tradition grew around that when you went into a unit, you would have these different coins. And the interesting thing about these coins is not that they're metal, not that they're worth anything, but simply that they're tangible reminders of what you were doing at that moment in time. So for this one, 305th Air Refueling Air Mobility Wing. I was the executive officer for the support group. 9/11 happened. When I pick up this coin, I am suddenly not here. I am in the middle of New Jersey. And the 2 towers have just been hit, and the Pentagon's just been hit. And I've just been in New York the month before, and I've just been to an office that had vacated a particular wing of the Pentagon that had been hit earlier this summer as well. All of the FEMA teams, as Federal Emergency Management Agencies, they assembled where I was stationed. I actually helped with essentially the logistical servicing of that. One of the more interesting stories was the fact that traffic on and off the base was literally taking 3 hours because we ramped up security so much. One of the more interesting phone calls I had to take was negotiating with the local schools on why kids from one district couldn't get home because the kids from another district were taking too long to get on and off the base. So there's all these things, and the point is that when you do something, yes, the mementos are good, but when something happens, other things get changed. So it wasn't just that the towers fell and that real people died. There were huge ripple effects, and the Department of Homeland Security is one of them, but there were lots of little smaller effects. So when you're imagining that plausible future and you're taking actions, remember that there are people around you that are affected by your choices, and you should talk with those significant others in your life that's going to be affected because you're choosing to do this and not this. It's not just you when you're imagining things. So folks, whether you're reading a book or you're holding a memento and you're thinking about this world that you were in or that you could be in if the book were real, or you're watching a movie and you're engrossed in it, it's important to be able to push the rest of the world around you and sort of drive that point home. I want to highlight a couple things that may help you imagine that just a little bit more. Tony Stark, the great Iron Man, right? In Iron Man 2, he rediscovers an atom that his father has encoded in the World's Fair back when his father was running Stark Industries. And there's a scene in that movie, and He goes from, he's clapped his hands, and he zooms out, and suddenly that atom is there in 3D space, and Tony can interact with it and push the electrons and all those sorts of things. Take a snow globe. Snow globes are cool. We're not talking, as Matt Sikoski asked me not to. Snow globes are cool. Snow globes are cool because when you look at them, especially if you bought one while you're down at Disney, again, it's a memento. And you can imagine yourself inside of there, and there's no limit. There's no actual glass, right? You are just lost inside of that world. Same thing with the Hoberman sphere. These toys that kids get where they zoom in and out, and again, there's a shot there on the slide. It's not just the fact that it's a cool interactive toy, but it's this ability to say, oh, I can get lost inside of these things. And in that particular instance, you see the kid actually, that sphere is big enough, he's inside of it. So when you're imagining your future, it's important to push everything else away. Mentally block it out. That is why multitasking isn't the greatest thing in the world, because there are things such as cultivating your imagination that require you to say, I'm isolated right now, I'm not available. I'm focused on what I'm doing, and what I'm doing is imagining something very powerful that's going to affect my life. Up until now, we've been talking about imagining things, and it's sort of been out there, right? You're in a book, you have a memento. Now we're going to move to some concrete examples of things that have affected my life and have enabled me to leverage imagination in the way I can. Before we do that, as part of that transition, I want to talk about reality and perception. There's these two individuals. They're on opposite ends of a stadium and they've got some megaphones. And it might be possible, or they could be cell phones, take your pick. The point is that if there's no one else around distracting you from your conversation or your world, then reality is kind of easy to get a handle on it. Well, I'm talking with this person said this, I said that, and assuming you communicate well, then that becomes very straightforward, a very straightforward exchange. But what if the game's going on? What if life is going on? What if all these other factors are coming into play? You have these things that are distracting from the conversation, and they're not just distracting from the conversation, but they're affecting the ability of those two individuals to communicate. They're not sure what they're hearing, and they're miscommunicating. And the same thing can happen with your imagination. If you don't know who you are, then imagining where you can go becomes very, very difficult. And why this is so important to me is that PhD I mentioned, it took 20 years. When you finish a goal like that and you don't necessarily have an immediate goal right after that, it becomes hard to say, well, what should I do now? So I went through a period of time of, wait a minute, I don't have a goal to replace that. So I consciously, whereas that goal was I was a young kid, dreamy-eyed. Now I'm a mature adult, or a more mature adult. I am intentionally choosing a new goal, but I'm not sure what I want that goal to be. So the last couple of years have been that process. So it turns out that my mom likes to sew, and more importantly, my mom likes to quilt. So this is a quilt. Back in the day, quilts were a family heirloom. To Chris Algieri from Mom, December 25th, 2004. What about quilts that tell stories? This quilt was made by my mom for my daughter. So there's a story that goes here, right? It brings me back to when my daughter was born, and that her life was young, and that there was a whole world ahead of her. Those things define us. Those moments define us, and it's important for you to know the moments that define you. In my case, the week that she was born was the same week that the water cooler in our server room broke. It was the same week that I was trying to go teach at the Air Force Academy, and all these things just happened. And so all of a sudden, I'm able to crystallize these are milestones in my life. This is a smaller one. Light from the Air Force, F-16s. Now these are kind of the coolest planes out there. They call them long darts because they only have a single engine. Sometimes they crash. But the important thing is that for me, this was when I was on active duty, and my mom felt it was important to mark that. So what does this have to do with imagination? Well, to be quite frank with you, when my mom said she was quilting, I couldn't imagine this because I hadn't seen it before. And so the takeaway is that you have to expose yourself to things. Don't just stay in Nebraska because you live here and the rest of the world is big and scary. Don't just not listen to music because it's not the music you grew up with. Don't tell your kids, well, you shouldn't be on team sports because I wasn't when I was a kid and they weren't necessary for me growing up. In general, don't limit yourself. And that's the beauty of pictures. They allow us to imagine things. There's a scene in Voyage of the Dawn Treader when the picture comes alive. And what if pictures actually did that? What if you could step into those worlds? Or if you like the picture, what if you could create that world for yourself? Of course, I have a quilt about books. Practically lived at the library when I was a kid. If you live in Nebraska and Colorado and Austin, Texas, you end up eventually with a quilt that reminds you of the Midwest. Why are they important to me? Those are very detailed quilts. Your imagination should have the ability to be detailed. When I read a book, I actually read it multiple times. Part of the reason why is that I'm fleshing in that world that I'm imagining. If I'm doing new research, I do the same thing. I'll read the paper once, twice, third time. I'm filling in that image in my mind of what's going on, my ability to understand it, interact with it, to the point that when someone says data, it's almost literally real to me. Do all of you need to do that? No. But you should have this ability to say, well, here's the world I have, and that's the world that I want to go to. And what are the adjacent possibles that I need to get to? And if it comes down to writing it down as a list, do it. If it comes down to talking with a friend, do it. The point is, if you don't like where you are today, or you're not where you want to be, then you should be thinking about imagining what that should be and how you can get there. So that was my mom and some of her influences on my life. We're going to talk now about my dad and some of his influences on my life. It turns out that back in the 80s, video games came out. Before that, they had pinball games and those sorts of things. The important one was video games, because video games made it possible to have a room full of machines where kids drop quarters. And what if I want to incentivize them to stay longer? Let's add ticket dispensers. You get a ticket, you trade in the ticket for prizes. So the tech problem was simply, how do you take a console unit and how do you create a ticket dispenser and how do you integrate the two? One's very digital, one's very mechanical. And this was the early days of computing, folks. Right? This wasn't when, the laptops we have today, yeah, they're awesome, but back then, they weren't that awesome. I know I owned most of them. In fact, there's one right here. To give you an idea of why I'm familiar with tech, and before we get into the details of this, I grew up around this stuff. This happens to be a Timex Sinclair 1000. The coolest thing about this computer was that when you typed run, the screen turned off. Why? Because the CPU, it was just one CPU and it was handling screen writes and computation. And if you said run lots of computations, it would turn the screen off and be able to run 4 times faster. So I grew up around toys like this. My dad brought them home all the time. Made me very comfortable on tech. But the cooler thing, and the thing that took me years longer to appreciate, was that I grew up around games. And I grew up around this ability to say, what if I can go into a world that doesn't exist and manipulate objects in a way to create a world that does exist? And in the professional environment, that's a very powerful skill. It turns out that my dad worked at a lot of big companies. Raytheon, RCA, Burroughs, Sperry, they both merged to become Unisys. And eventually he went to moonlight for this little company called Deltronic Labs outside of Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. Deltronic Labs was co-located with a company called the Philadelphia Toboggan Company, which immediately you start thinking sleds. They were actually famous for making roller coaster cars. They had a side business, a little side business called skee-ball. Yes, ladies and gentlemen, the skee-ball you see at Chuck E. Cheese and everywhere else around the country. So we have skee-ball, and we have ticket dispensers. And they did video games, and they put them together with skee-ball. So they solved the tech solution, right? We've got ticket dispensers, ticket counters, ticket eaters. That's the technical problem. What about the bigger problem? The magic problem. What is your magic problem? That's really the question you should be asking yourself. There's a really good book about what you didn't learn at Harvard MBA. In there, there's this vignette about the head of Rolex. And one day someone walks up to the head of Rolex and says, hey, how's the watch business? Without blinking an eye, the Rolex CEO looks back and says, we're not in the watch business. We're in the luxury business. That's the magic problem. They weren't in the business of ticket dispensers. They were in the entertainment business. They were in the business of helping lots of little kids enjoy themselves for a moment in time. They're also in the business of taking lots of money from their parents, but we're sort of going to gloss over that part of the story. Really want to focus on the business they're in is creating a positive, constructive, enjoyable environment and rewarding environment for these kids. So when you go into Chuck E. Cheese, you see those skee-ball machines, you see those ticket dispensers, you see that ticket eater. know that my dad, for many years, was the only EE electronics engineer that worked for that company. Those digital lights you see on Skee-Ball, that was my dad. The digital lights you see on that ticket eater and the barcode, that was my dad. That's what I grew up around. I grew up around games and electronics and the ability to be in a business that involves making people happy. That's a stroke of luck, of serendipity. That's not something that I could have asked for at birth. That's just what I happened to end up doing. So when people wonder why I'm like Skyview or why I'm interested in Dave Homan's work with Slouch Couch, I grew up around games, ladies and gentlemen. And you can peek in that little ticket eater and you can see Deltronic Labs, and that's a little company in Chalfont, Pennsylvania that's touched your life, your kids' lives, and likely the lives of many kids that you know. Their first, you see that mechanical Skee-Ball, the first job my dad actually did for the company was to convert it from mechanical to digital. Incremental innovation, but it brought Skee-Ball into the modern era. So my mom's influence on my life, or at least some of it, my dad's influence on my life, or at least some of it, and why I'm comfortable in a tech space. I grew up around it. You should be helping your kids grow up around things so that they're comfortable around them. Forming you. Everybody's got a story like this. My parents, they're happily married. There's me, there's the TV I watched the Olympics on, it's the TV I watched when Reagan got shot and how the world handled that. Graduation, me getting told I'm really good at reading, a math contest, finding out I'm good at math. And you see the mullet haircut, that's my dad going, I can't wait till this kid's out of here, he's going in the military. And that last little one, the directions said you couldn't build this more than 5 high without it collapsing. Well, I got it up to 20 and I figured they didn't know what they were talking about. The point is, don't accept the limits that people put around you. Be about pushing those limits in a way that makes the world a better place, that helps you expand who you are, helps you expand the ability to relate to people. Then there's the maturing you. So that stuff, a lot of it I don't remember. I have pictures of it, so I imagine what that world was like. I can't actually remember much of that. But then there's the parts that I do remember, the life after that 10, 12, and certainly life after 18, and that's this slide. This is the piece of my life that I actually remember that's influencing me. Top of Mount Fuji, 9/11, the dog my parents replaced me with, trip to Mexico, a trip back to Korea with 3 good friends, trip to San Francisco before taking a train across the country, just because. Then there's the inspired you, and if there's one slide I want you to remember, if there's one vignette I want you to remember, it's the inspired you. So for me, there was a turning point in my life when I went from, well, gee, I'm a short, fat kid who can read, to, wait a minute, maybe I can do something with my life. And for me, that was the 1985 spelling bee. The inspired you. In my case, that was a spelling bee. And it wasn't because I had to study, and it wasn't because my friends pushed me or my parents pushed me. It was simply because I went from, I'm a smart kid, I'm not so good at sports, to, wait, I can actually do something with that. And maybe I can do something with all those things I'm not so good at as well. And so at that moment, that period of time, I went from that short, fat kid there to someone who said, wait a minute, it's possible to set goals and to work toward goals. That's a huge step to go from I'm just meandering through life to I can choose a direction I want to go. And so what I want you to remember is that the same is true for you and for your kids and for people that are around you and that you influence. And it's important for you to know who you are, and it's important for you to know who they are, and it's important for each of you to understand where each of you wants to go, so you can encourage each other, so that you can back each other up, so that you can say, hey, are you sure you want to do this? Because I thought you wanted to go over here. That's why the inspired you is important. Then of course there's the recent you. In my case, the recent you is, I got a PhD. I lived in Austin for a couple of years running an analytics division we did a government intelligence work, contracted company. I came here and worked at the University of Nebraska for a while. I got a research initiative spun up. And then I said, that's all fun, but what I really miss is the ability to define the problem space that I work in. And to be able to go into a company and say, your folks don't look so happy. In fact, they look like they want to innovate something, or you're coming to me asking me to innovate something, and so we want to help you do that. And so basically, I get paid all day to help people imagine their future. So folks, there's lots of pieces of you, there's facets of you. There's the formative you may not remember all of that. There's the maturing you, you'd likely remember most of that, or at least understand most of it. There's the recent you, those things that are going on around you even right now, even being in this room. You're adapting, your mind is changing. The people you interact with are changing. If you put all that together, you end up with the collective you, the who you are. That's your social networks, the timeline, where you've lived. All of those things that define you and your existence. It's important to know that and to share it, because that is what enables you to imagine where you could go. And understanding where you can go and doing that effectively and enjoyably is often predicated on knowing who you are today. Because otherwise things take longer than they should, or you end up where you thought you might not be. Being in touch with yourself is perhaps the most significant aspect of cultivating your personal imagination and where you can go in life, whether that's professionally, relationally, physically. If you want to go base jump, that's actually going to be on the next slide. That's the future you. We're going to have one last little trick we'll talk about. The future you. Who do you want to be tomorrow? Who do you want to be the day after that, and after that, and a year down the road, and 10 years down the road? Rock climbing, base jumping, strength training, performing arts. In many of those instances, one of the skills that is cultivated is this ability to visualize, this ability to see in your mind's eye, or to feel you executing the movements. For me, the closest happens to be strength training. I can lay down on a bench and I can literally see myself doing the repetitions. I can block out everything else around me. I close my eyes. Now, I'm not going to use this in the gym, but for some of you, this may be a useful exercise. I use it for sleeping. And make sure you put it on right. So there's a little pad down here. First time I used it, it was upside down. It doesn't feel dry, that's closed. So I'm going to put this on. Throw in some earplugs if that's necessary. You got to be careful. You do this too long, people can actually go crazy. But depriving yourself of sensory input for a period of time, when you're consciously engaged in imagining your future, can be a very powerful tool, just like reading a book, just like sketching out what those adjacent possibles are. And so I would encourage you to do that. I would encourage you to do those things. Get in touch with yourself, visualize where you want to be, understand who you are so you can share that story. Appreciate perspective, appreciate where you've come from. And with that, ladies and gentlemen, go imagine your future. Thank you.